Okay, so thank you so much for your kind introduction. I'm Tsuyoshi Ishihara. So I basically prepared the papers. I'd like to read it. Okay, I'm going to use PowerPoint slides. Okay, so today I'd like to talk about the ways in which Mark Twain and his works were used in American textbooks for secondary school education from the 1950s to the 1960s. Millions of Americans were introduced to Mark Twain's stories in their classrooms, and their impressions of Twain must have been greatly influenced by the ways in which they studied his works in school. Although neither Twain nor his young male protagonists were keen on going to school, Twain and his works have been extremely popular in school curricula and have repeatedly been included in school textbooks. Textbooks can provide us with valuable information if we are to understand how Twain was taught in the classrooms of the time, and examination of them will surely contribute to clarifying the ways in which the American public's perception of Twain was shaped. Although there is Professor Joseph Cicela's amazing book, Canons by Consensus, a fascinating comprehensive study about college-level American literature anthologies, in Twain's scholarship, not much has been done about the secondary school-level literature textbooks. In this presentation, I'd like to mainly examine the secondary school textbooks' uses of Twain and his literature from the 1950s to the 1960s, the time of drastic change of American culture and society. So these are the topics to be covered today: inaccuracies and exaggerations of the information about Twain. How did the textbooks handle the issues of race, particularly N-word in Huck Finn? Reference to the new media, particularly audio-visual media, that might be useful for teaching Twain, and growing interest in Twain's darker writings in 1960s textbooks. Twain was one of the favorite choices for textbooks in the 1950s and 1960s. Sometimes Twain was the only 19th century prose writer to be provided with an independent chapter. Twain often enjoyed the highest number of pages among all writers, and sometimes exceeded even Shakespeare in the amount of space provided. Textbooks of the 1950s and 1960s demonstrated their increasing interest in Twain as a public figure. Various textbooks of that period treated him as America's most famous literary celebrity by including numerous pictures and illustrations that visually captured various phases of his well-known life. For instance, the selection of Rudyard Kipling's article about his famous visit to Twain's house, Twain here in Elmira, in 1889, appeared in a 1963 textbook. In fact, Kipling's interview of Twain in Elmira was well publicized at the time this article appeared in the textbook, as can be seen in this colorful advertisement for bourbon whiskey that came out just a few months before the appearance of this textbook article. However, celebrities such as Twain often have to live surrounded by inaccurate information about their lives and activities, as shown by one of his most famous quotes, quote, "The report of my death was an exaggeration," unquote. Information about Twain was sometimes sprinkled with non-factual assumptions and fabrications. Even textbooks sometimes did not make enough effort to ensure the accuracy by consulting reliable sources. For example, a high school textbook in the 1950s writes that, quote, "Twain lived in Connecticut for the rest of his life after his marriage." As we all know, Twain lived in a variety of places after his marriage, including New York, Florence, Berlin, Vienna, and London. Another high school textbook in the 1950s also says, quote, "Mark, who was only 18 at the time, had the exciting experience of traveling in the overland stage from the Missouri frontier to Nevada," unquote. Although Twain portrayed himself in Roughing It as a young tenderfoot, he had already turned 25, not 18, when he started his journey to the West. Fortunately, as represented by scholarly works by Kenneth Lin, Walter Blair, Henry Nash Smith, Leo Marx, Lee Budd, James M. Cox, Justin Kaplan, Sidney Cross, and Albert E. Stone, Twain's scholarship thrived after the late 1950s, and some of them contributed to the editorship of anthology textbooks and textbook editions of Huck Finn from the late 1950s to the 60s. As expected, the information on Twain in these textbooks is far more accurate than the others. It was fortunate that some notable Twain scholars in the 50s and 60s came out of the ivory tower and greatly contributed to the improvement of the school textbooks of the time. Excerpts from Huck Finn appeared in US textbooks 7 times in the 50s and 2 times in the 60s. What is most surprising about the selections from Huck Finn in the 1950s is the near complete absence of race and slavery. The part most frequently anthologized in 1950s textbooks was the scene in which Huck is disguised as a girl and has humorous exchanges with Mrs. Loftus, whose tricks eventually show that Huck is a boy. Although Mrs. Loftus talks about the ongoing hunt for the runaway slave Jim, it is difficult to call either slavery or race the central topic of this episode. Even from the story about the bloodshed between the Granger Ford and the Shepherdsons, a reference to slavery was erased. For instance, while Huck was addressed by his slave as Master George, in Twain's original, all of its appearances were quietly dropped from its selection. No wonder the slave character Jim is almost non-existent in the anthologized Huck Finn in 1950s textbooks. Under this politically correct editorship, the N-word in Huck Finn was, of course, unacceptable. Regarding the selection from Huck Finn, almost all textbooks in the 50s and 60s avoided reprinting the word. The N-word was replaced by neutral terms such as servant, him, hands, folks, help, boy, runaway, slave, and so forth. The scenes and sentences in which the N-word was used were often either eliminated or avoided in the selections. Although they were not prominent, there were critical responses to the editorial intervention in Huck Finn. For instance, while adapted versions of Huck Finn were published by some of the major textbook companies in the early 1950s, they were not always perceived as appropriate educational materials. In 1957, for example, New York City's Board of Education decided to drop an adapted version of Huck Finn from the approved textbook list in junior high classrooms, and that version was the N-word entirely removed. In the midst of the increasing awareness of racial minorities that led to the outburst of the civil rights movement of the late 1950s and 1960s, the textbook publishers were already well aware of the risk involved in mistreating racial issues in their textbooks. In 1955, for instance, the American Textbook Publishers Institute published a pamphlet entitled "Textbooks Are Indispensable" and wrote about the difficult task faced by textbook publishers. Quote, "Textbooks must try to avoid statements that might prove offensive to economic, religious, racial, or social groups, or any civil, fraternal, patriotic, or philanthropic societies in the whole United States," unquote. Controversial content in textbooks often mean loss of sales. To avoid significant losses, textbooks tended to avoid as much as possible the risky issues that might offend certain social or ethnic groups. Obviously, the majority of the textbooks chose not to challenge this difficult task by erasing the issue of race and avoiding the N-word in their selections from Huck Finn. In the 1950s, one of the teacher's manuals for high school literature textbooks says, quote, "Today, under the pressure of rapidly skyrocketing high school enrollments, literature courses are being re-examined to bring content and methods closer to the wide-ranging interests of our young people," unquote. Clearly, the incorporation of more informal materials was one of the methods employed by textbook publishers, quote, 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 unquote, the students with non-literary, non-academic interests in mind. Textbook editors were also aware that Twain's writings had become even more challenging for many students. For instance, one of the teacher's manuals for 9th grade textbook in the 1950s designated its selection from Huck Finn, quote unquote, very difficult, the most difficult category in that textbook. Another teacher's manual for a 7th grade textbook in the 1950s also suggested that teachers not start with a selection from Tom Sawyer, since it is the, quote unquote, most difficult work chosen for the students in that textbook. Facing this rapidly growing enrollment of less literary students, a number of textbooks incorporated audio-visual materials in the discussion of Twain and his works in order to make his work appeal to a wider range of students. For example, the Teacher's Guide for one of the 1960s textbooks listed recently produced audio-visual materials such as the film adaptation of Huck Finn and the audio recordings of reading of his representative works. Perhaps one of the most unique examples was the audio recording of Mark Twain Tonight, the acclaimed Twain impersonator Hal Holbrook's one-man stage show. This performance was recommended as one of the extended study materials in teacher's manual for one of the high school textbooks of the early 1960s. As we know, the show started in the mid-1950s, and by the time this textbook was published, it had already been performed off-Broadway. In 1966, Mark Twain Tonight was premiered on Broadway, and Holbrook won a Tony Award for the best performance by a leading actor of the same year. In 1967, the show was also broadcast on National Network Television, CBS, and nominated for an Emmy Award. In the 1960s, many teachers and students must have been fascinated by Holbrook's performance. For example, a former high school English teacher recalls, quote, "In 1967, I was a 20-ish high school English teacher who sat down one evening out of a sense of professional obligation to watch a TV production of some guy named Hal Holbrook doing a one-man show called Mark Twain Tonight. It blew me away, though we didn't talk like that in 1967. I paid cash money for the 33 RPM record and scratched my way to this or that band for partly appreciative teen English students," unquote. There must have been a number of students who shared teachers' enthusiasms about Holbrook's performance. One of Amazon.com's online reviewers of the DVD recording of his show says, quote, "I was introduced to Hal Holbrook's Mark Twain Tonight in a high school English class in 1962, and I have been fascinated with Hal Holbrook and his Twain presentation ever since," unquote. Even today, there seems nothing comparable to Holbrook's geniuses in recreating Twain's performances. These words show how valuable his performances were, even in classrooms. Holbrook will surely be missed as the greatest contributor for the development of students' understanding of Mark Twain. Twain's works, anthologized in textbooks, were also immensely diversified, particularly in the 1960s. Even his darker and satirical writings, such as A Private History of a Campaign That Failed, The Man That Corrupted Hadleyburg, and The War Prayer, started appearing in the textbooks. The inclusion of these textbooks was consistent with the shift of publication and scholarship in the 1960s that gave greater attention to Twain's darker stories. Perhaps, in terms of its impact on public perceptions of Twain, the most significant incident was the publication of Letters from the Earth in 1962, edited by leading Twain scholar Bernard DeVoto. As we know, the book is a collection of fictional letters by the Archangel Satan to Archangel Gabriel and Michael, which are highly satirical and pertain to Twain's view of Christianity. Although this work was written in 1909, 1 year before Twain's death, it had been suppressed for many years by the order of his daughter Clara to protect the reputation of his father. While the work was shocking to many, it sold well and was even listed as New York Times bestseller. As John Bird rightly said, since the 1960s, with the publication of Mark Twain's late, often fragmentary, unfinished works, the metaphor of dark Twain has been a matter of critical contention. These last works, bitter, sarcastic, polemical, often nihilistic, brought about a change in the way we think of Mark Twain. The genial humorist, crackerbox sage, and chronicler of nostalgic boyhood became, for many readers, a darker, more brooding figure, unquote. In 1960s, the period when the conventional norms of American culture and society were greatly challenged in various spheres, it was not difficult to find textbooks that emphasized Twain's critical views toward America. For example, A Teacher's Guide to one of the 1960s textbooks that reprinted The Man That Crafted Hadleyburg presents instructors with the following quotation and sample answers on the work. Quote, question, what elements of American life is Clemens criticizing? The answer, the tendency to certain elements of society toward false piety, uprightness, accompanied by meanness and hypocrisy. Another question, does this story have relevance for modern America? Answer, opinion will differ, unquote. While these questions are open to various answers, no one can deny that the textbook suggestion of the possibility of reading the story as an attack on contemporary America resonates with the critical atmosphere about American society in the 1960s. Is Twain a challenger or advocate of America? A Teacher's Guide for one of the late 1960s textbooks recognized this question as one of the most significant topics. It writes, quote, an attempt to relate Mark Twain to the major theme of the course, the search for American identity, poses some provocative questions. Did Twain actually search for American values, or did he criticize them? Unquote. This is a dilemma that Twain, the people's favorite American icon, was destined to face whenever he attacked America. However, Twain could represent American values without compromising his rebellious attitude. In a way, as shown by public admiration for radical mobilization for the revolution, a rebellious mind is often celebrated as an important part of American tradition. In the 1960s, the period when rebellious activists gained greater presence in American society, even school textbooks, whose contents are usually socially conservative in nature, felt it necessary to pay attention to the American tradition of social rebels. While it was certainly not a mainstream literature textbook, one of the late 1960s textbooks entitled The Social Rebel in American Literature writes the following in the preface. Quote, it is a significant fact that much of the serious literature of America has since its beginning been one of criticism, dissent, rebellion, a double-sided mirror that reflected not only social practices but also the underlying ideals and aspirations of America. The theme of social rebellion is a fundamental one, perhaps the fundamental one in American literature, unquote. The choice of Twain's work in this textbook is a war prayer, a powerful critique of the senselessness and religious hypocrisy of patriotic fervor over an atrocious war, which was perhaps one of the timeliest works by Twain during the anti-Vietnam War era. We know that Twain's works did not always present a fascinating picture of American life. Even in his best-loved adventure story, Huck Finn, the dark sides of society and human nature were repeatedly revealed through the realistic eyes of its boy protagonist. As we saw, the unwelcome sides of his writings were often locked away and kept them unseen by student readers. In that sense, the closet was finally opened in the 1960s, as almost for the first time in the history of US textbooks. In this way, students were finally introduced to the exciting but dangerous world of Mark Twain. Thank you very much for listening.